Welcome to a special series of NASP podcasts on social justice. I'm Dan Florell, the NASP Online Communication Coordinator, and I'm pleased to introduce some of the many contributors to this special issue. So today we have the facilitator, Shireen Nasser, and several participants, including Dave Schreiberg, Charles Barrett, and Khadijah Sorrell. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Shireen to introduce our social justice series.
Welcome, everyone, to the first School Psychologists for Social Justice podcast. We're so glad you're joining us today for our kickoff podcast, where we'll be trying to understand what really is social justice and how social justice applies to us as school psychologists. This podcast is the first in a series of 8 podcasts delving deeper into some of the questions we'll bring up today. Your podcast series facilitators are Dr. Sherry Proctor, Dr. Sakara Fisher, Dr. Dave Schreiberg, and myself, Dr. Shireen Nasser. Throughout the series, the 4 of us will be hosting different podcasts featuring guest speakers who are trailblazers in our profession. These podcasts are part of NASP and the Social Justice Task Force's efforts to help build a library of resources for school psychologists interested in social justice. I'm honored to host today's podcast, and I'm joined by 3 fantastic guests. I could introduce them, but I won't be able to do them justice, so I will let them introduce themselves. Khadijah, why don't you start?
My name is Khadijah Sorrell. I'm a third-year PhD student in school psychology at the University of Rhode Island. My interests include social justice advocacy, multiculturalism, and education disparities. And the work that I've been doing with Social Justice Task Force has been very fulfilling, and I'm more than excited to be a part of the podcast today.
Thanks, Khadijah. I'm happy to have you. As I mentioned earlier, this podcast is part of a greater initiative to create resources for school psychologists interested in learning more about social justice and how it impacts our work. With me today is Dr. Charles Barrett, the co-chair of the Social Justice Task Force. Charles, would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about the Social Justice Task Force of NASP?
My name is Charles Barrett. I'm a school psychologist with Loudoun County Public Schools, which is about 35 miles south of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. I've also had the honor of serving as the co-chair of the Task Force for Social Justice with some amazing practitioners, school psychology grad students, and trainers. I'm excited about this series and looking forward to our talk today. Last year, the task force started by NASP immediate past president Melissa Reeves in response to some resources that were released during the summer of 2016, specifically around race and privilege. As we began thinking about the realities of some of our students in schools across, it became clear that more work needed to be done around social justice. So from that, she tasked us with developing resources for school psychologists to begin addressing some of these issues related to social justice in our work. And we've been doing that since last year, since last fall.
Great. Thanks, Charles. Last but not least is Dave. Dave, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Dave Schreiberg. I'm a school psychologist and a professor of education at Loyola University Chicago. I've been doing research and teaching and advocacy work related to school psychology and social justice for about the last 10 or 12 years. And I've been so honored and have enjoyed being a member of NASP Social Justice Task Force for the last since it began in 2016.
As I mentioned earlier, this is the kickoff podcast for an 8-part series delving into topics important to social justice and school psychology. Some of the topics we'll be covering in future podcasts include the school-to-prison pipeline and creating safe spaces in schools for LGBTQ+ youth, among other topics. However, the purpose of today's podcast is to lay groundwork for what we mean by social justice and to better understand how it relates to school psychology. Dave, would you mind giving us a little background on what is social justice?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is something that NASP has been grappling with quite a bit, and in April of 2017, NASP actually created and endorsed the definition of social justice. This definition came from research done with NASP members, graduate students, and cultural diversity experts in school psychology, as well as the feedback from a number of NASP leaders and experts in the field. So let me just read you the definition of social justice that NASP has put out, but you can also find on NASP website on the social justice page. So here's the definition. Social justice is both a process and a goal that requires action. School psychologists work to ensure the protection of the educational rights, opportunities, and well-being of all children, especially those whose voices have been muted, identities obscured, or needs obscured. Social justice requires promoting non-discriminatory practices and the empowerment of families and communities. School psychologists enact social justice through culturally responsive professional practice and advocacy to create schools, communities, and systems that ensure equity and fairness for all children. So it's a bit of a mouthful. So let me pick out a few areas of it that I would highlight within that broader definition. First, so one way you might think of social justice is that it's sort of it's a goal, it's an aspirational vision for the type of society we would like to see, and for school psychologists in particular, the types of schools that we'd like to support all children. So one way of social justice is sort of more aspirational. Another way to think about social justice that's highlighted in this definition is that it flows directly from culturally responsive practice. So along with that, you can think of social justice kind of as a filter or a lens for taking in information. So are we noticing injustices? For example, are we noticing things like what's commonly found in racial discrepancies in school discipline data? And are we noticing positive social justice action? So maybe a teacher that's engaging in particularly strong culturally responsive practice. So the second way is culturally responsive practice. And then the third way you might think of it is that it's social justice as a verb. It's something that we school psychologists do. In the research that I've conducted with school psychologists, most often people associate those action steps with advocacy, either with or on behalf of those who are most vulnerable. That advocacy also involves knowledge of our best practices and ethical codes. So I think the challenge for me and for others is to think about how do we go from those kind of broad aspirational visions into our work. For me as a professor, I think about social justice in terms of the type when I do research projects. Am I doing projects that support children's rights? I mentioned, and I'm drawn to that as a topic because bullying to me is a violation of social justice. I also see it as directly tied to my work as a professor in terms of helping to shape the next generation of school psychologists. We graduate school psychologists that are culturally responsive and have the skills and awareness to go out and advocate with and support of others.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you talk, Dave, about kind of social justice as a lens through which we work through, but then also that concrete example of anti-bullying projects that you've worked with. And I think that for me, I also need something kind of concrete to hold on to and work with. I've used the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, you also mentioned child rights, as a way to have words and a consistent lens to work through in my work as well, both as a professor, in my work, my practice, and my research, my work with students. Using that framework, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, has given me specific language that I can work with teachers. I've actually been helping teachers in a fourth grade classroom develop a social emotional learning curriculum using the language from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, kind of as a way for them to integrate that language beyond just the social emotional learning lessons that they're doing, and to help ensure that they're not only teaching students the social skills they need, but also addressing kind of the skills and the rights that they have even outside of the classroom. So that's been really meaningful, and my teachers actually were just giving me some feedback about how they really appreciated being able to have that integration in the way they talk to their students throughout the day. So that's been really neat. And I know many of us have been taking that social justice lens, not just integrating it into who we are and how we work, but into other concrete ways. Khadija, do you have an example maybe of a concrete way that you've used social justice in your work?
Yeah, and I just want to say that, Shireen and Dave, I really like how you incorporated social justice into the work that you are doing, both as professors and practitioners. I know for me, social justice work and advocacy has always been a passion of mine, and it's the very reason why I decided to pursue a PhD in school psychology in the first place. I think that social justice should be entrenched into everything we do, and I apply social justice lens into my coursework, my research interests, my practicum experiences, as well as being a teacher, because I'm currently a teacher assistant for a general psychology class here at the University of Rhode Island. One of the instances where I've incorporated social justice work into my graduate coursework was when we had an assignment where we had to present for my physio class on one of the psychopathologies, where I decided to focus on the neurological basis of depression, and I used that platform to discuss how depression may be expressed in different ethnic groups, such as African Americans, Asians, American Indians / Native Americans, and especially since research is typically normed and focused on white middle-class individuals, I thought it was important to emphasize non-majority groups. And in addition, as a PhD student, you are required to spend at least your first 2 years gaining practicum experiences within a school. So I was very active with the practicum placements that I chose, and I made sure to gain experiences working in racially and ethnically diverse populations, because I believe that social justice work includes working with and helping families and students of underserved populations.
It was really well said, Kijay. I like how you center the people that you're working with in your work. I think that's kind of at the core of social justice work, is, centering the people that we're working with. Charles, do you want to share a concrete example on a way that you've used social justice lens in your work?
So my entire practice has been, or my experience has been, always working with schools and students, families who are diverse, oftentimes marginalized, lower income groups as well. So my entire approach, pretty much everything that I do, is through a lens of social justice. I guess I would say that, whereas diversity talks about inclusion and kind of having different voices represented, I think social justice takes it a step further and talks about equity and really providing what's necessary for various groups to be successful, or to really have the access to resources that are meaningful and that are necessary for success in school. So I see my role as a school psychologist really trying to advocate for students and families to really promote equity rather than only diversity.
Absolutely, and I do think that advocacy is at the core of a lot of what we do as school psychologists, and using that social justice framework allows us to build on that advocacy for equity, as you mentioned. I know, I love working with each of you as part of the task force, and I know I've heard your story. Each of you to social justice in your practice, your training, your research. I think I'd love to hear a little bit more about what social justice doesn't just mean as a NAS definition or as a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child lens, but what it means to you personally. Why do you think it matters for school psychologists generally? Dave, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, while my profession is school psychology, and I'm passionate about the field of school psychology. A lot of my the reason why I got focused on social justice originally really comes from just my own personal background and experience. So in my case, I grew up in an environment. My parents were. I'm a white cisgender male, right? So sometimes people don't necessarily associate white males with social justice, or at least that's a question I get a lot. So why are you interested in social justice? Because in a lot of ways, my life has been I've been in the dominant group in most categories. But I was sort of raised with before I knew the term social justice, my parents sort of raised me with the value with stories of the 1960s, which is when they were young, and going on freedom rides and civil rights struggle. And kind of the message I got was like, our purpose in life is to make the world a better place. And if there are injustices, it's our role to address them. That's also tied up very much in my own religious identity, being Jewish, and narratives of overcoming oppression, and the idea that as Jews we have a responsibility to not only look out for ourselves but for others. So I kind of grew up with that mindset before thinking of social justice. I went to college, and as I like to say to my students, like, when I didn't realize I was white until I went to college, and that was very eye-opening for me. And what I mean by that is, like, I was really blind to white privilege, and I had a series of, frankly, some very painful experiences where, I sort of said, well, I'm a nice guy, I'm a good guy, I'm not, running around with, white supremacist rallies or doing things outwardly to harm people. I'm a good person. And what I realized, and what I came to learn, is even though I might be a good person, I was still benefiting from structural racism that was supporting white males like myself. And so it was very sort of painful, as I said, to realize that. And then I feel like once you become aware of things like that, at least for me, you can't unknow them, right? So it was very sort of eye-opening, and I started to become just more aware of and interested in white privilege and just forms of oppression more generally. And then as I got into school psychology, one of the real draws for being in school psychology was working with kids and being in their real world, or at least their school world. Then you start to see, we talked earlier, kind of a lens. If you're having sort of a multicultural lens and you have a degree of awareness, I've got a long way to go for sure, but at least initial degree of awareness of things like white privilege, you start seeing social injustices everywhere. And I've become since then, so it started as kind of a personal identity it's still there. I'm still trying to grow and overcome my own blind spots, but now as my own professional identity is going to really try to incorporate that into the work, my own work, and really help to do my part to promote school psychology as a field, engaging around social justice issues.
Thanks for sharing, Dave. I really appreciate that. I appreciate your story, and I think that's really neat. Khadija, what brought you to social justice? What brought you?
I think as a school psychologist, it's imperative to recognize and acknowledge disparities in social injustice, and I really like how Dave brought that point up about his awareness, and I find it very interesting. And I think it's important as school psychologists to engage in both direct and indirect services in communities disproportionately disenfranchised in education. I know for me, in my personal experience, what brought me to social justice derived from the fact that I grew up in a town called Hampton, Connecticut, which is a very it borders New Haven for those unfamiliar with the area, which is where Yale University is. And it's about 50% people of color and 50% white. So it's a very multicultural town. And going through the public education system, especially when I was in high school, I noticed that a lot of my peers of color were not taking college preparatory courses. So when I would walk through my high school halls, I would see people from all different shades and different cultures and just different races and ethnic groups. But when I entered into advanced placement or AP or honor courses, the classes were more homogenous and predominantly white. And this phenomenon and my personal experiences galvanized my desire to want to understand this phenomenon and how I could engage in work to help rectify what at that time in my life was a very visible achievement gap, and using my current interest in using the work that I'm doing now to try to understand that and use research to try to rectify that education disparities through a social justice platform.
And Khadija, one of the next questions I have for the team in general, so maybe you would be great to kind of expand on what you're talking about, is, I think all of us have this common lens of this wanting equity. Social justice means inclusivity for all in the practices that we do. And for us specifically as school psychologists, when we engage with something as important as education, I guess my next question for you is, well, what do you think for us as school psychologists, social justice means? What's next for us in school psychology when we're talking about social justice?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. As a PhD student, again, I think I have three priorities: to learn, to research, and to me, the most important is to teach. At the base of what we do as school psychologists is a fundamental mission to teach ourselves and to everyone willing to learn, whether that may be parents, children and adolescents, teachers, or other professionals. I think we need to increase our awareness, as well as others' awareness of the issues relating to underserved communities, and as well as what Dave was talking about when he brought up his personal experience about increasing his awareness about the social injustices and how it galvanized him to do actions. And I thought that was a really great story. And I think it's important to acknowledge our implicit biases that we may harbor and work on challenging our preconceived notions so we can begin the work needed to be more multiculturally competent school psychologists, and which in turn will help promote an environment that fosters an equitable education in our field.
Thanks. And Charles, I'd like you to answer that question next as well, if you can kind of build on what Khadija said of what's next for us as school psychologists as we think about moving forward and social justice?
So I think that it's a great question. I think that it's a complex question, but I think, as individual school psychologists, I think we start small. I think we start where we are at the time, to influence the practices and policies and the systems in which we work, be it a school, be it a local school division, or even in our states. We work with students as individuals, as families, as unique entities, different than any other family or student that we might encounter. So I think keeping in mind their unique lived experiences and allowing that to frame what we do for them specifically is the best way to, I guess, try to embed these principles of justice into all that we do. I think as we do that one at a time, be it one family at a time, one student at a time, one school at a time, then I think these practices become much more part of the fabric of our work as a profession of school psychologists.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And Dave, what about you? What question? This idea of what do we do next as school thinking about social justice? What's next for us?
Yeah, so I really would resonate a lot with what Charles just said about thinking small. In some ways, I think sometimes the social justice issues can seem so daunting, and they are, whether it's homophobia or systemic racism, xenophobia. These are deeply rooted, issues in our society that no one of us can overturn on our own. But we can focus on some things that we do have more control over, and then also work with others as a field to address some of the bigger issues. So I would say, just in terms of at the individual level, I think a lot of becoming an effective social justice advocate, it overlaps with leadership skills and also culturally responsive practice. So each of us has our own unique strengths and limitations as an advocate. So I mentioned before, so I'm like a white, straight male, right? So in some ways, from that perspective, there are going to be issues that I'm never going to fully understand in the same way that somebody that is experienced. I cannot understand fully what it's like to be a person of color in U.S. society, right? But what I can do is try to as an ally, to listen and to support those that are experiencing depression. So I think part of it is just kind of thinking like where is our piece in it? What we can control, what are some things we can control in terms of our own behavior and whether we act ethically and for justice. And then the leadership side also comes in as sort of what are some of our strengths. So again, to use use myself as an example, not because I'm particularly notable, but just as one example. So I'm like pretty soft-spoken, right? So if we're in a situation where we need somebody trying to like fire up the troops really loud, like I'm not necessarily the best person for that. So I like to align myself with people that are really good at that. And then what I tend to be better at is kind of working behind the scenes and helping to build coalitions together. So we need like all kinds of leadership strengths and skills, and we need collaborative action in school. So I think part of this is kind of being honest with yourself about what your own strengths and limitations are. It's finding ways to grow culturally in your own leadership skills, and also having the humility to bring in other people that are going to have a different perspective than you, and then maybe bring some different leadership skills to the table. As a field, I would say school psychology, if we think of our field as social justice as part of what we're about, and I'm so happy that that's the direction that the NASP has been moving by identifying social justice as one of our strategic aims. So if we're thinking that way, I think a lot of opportunities are going to present themselves for us as a field. School psychologists are potentially in a really unique and powerful position to bring about socially just change. We're psychologists, so we have that psychology training, right? So we're supposed to be good listeners, good observers, good at working with other people. For the most part, we generally are. And then we have this backstage pass to schools that almost no one else has. So again, recognizing that the different school psychologists are in different positions, and some are in better places to bring about change. We have this access to the ecology of schools, and whatever issues are going on in society also happen in schools. So I think that combination puts us in a really unique and potentially very powerful position to use our knowledge of the law, our knowledge of best practices, and our skills in working collaboratively with others to bring about change. But we have to see it first. We have to think of it as part of our mission. And then we have to also kind of have the idea that we can't do it ourselves. So how do we align with others, be they school psychologists or students, families, other professions, to work collaboratively and bring our skills to the table. So I apologize. I know it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I guess I would say like it starts with the personal, but then from there it progresses to kind of thinking collaboratively and systemically utilizing our unique school psychology skill set.
Yeah, I love that answer of collaboration because I know some social justice can feel really big. And I think the key to that is knowing that we're not alone. I know that right now, for school psychologists, it almost seems more urgent and more important than ever with the current refugee crisis, heightened awareness regarding racial inequality in our country, an ever changing, more diverse student body. Questions about how we ensure equal access to quality education for all students, I think, is kind of behind everything we're doing as school psychologists before, and even more so now. And I know I'm really excited to be collaborating with the Social Justice Task Force of NASP now, which, Charles, I know if you could speak a little bit more about some of the collaborations and resources through that we can plug into.
Sure. So I guess this first iteration of the task force, it's been going on since about fall of 2016 until now. There were three major areas that we focused on as far as developing resources for trainers, grad students, and also practicing school psychologists. They were around intersectionality, implicit bias, and of course, a specific group that was dedicated to developing resources for faculty who want to infuse or embed social justice themes in their teaching. So those things we've been releasing slowly. They are on the NASP website under the social justice page. They're also going to be featured in the communique. They've been starting this summer. Roughly every issue so far has something around social justice. The infographic will be coming out in the near future that talks about intersectionality. It's a great one-pager that people can use in their offices to kind of just highlight the many different dimensions of our students and our staff, our families. I think Dave's point is certainly well taken as far as changing how we think about the work and our mission. I think we embed that in our training to produce school psychologists in the future that have this framework. So it's not something that we add on to our work, it's kind of embedded in how we approach the field and mission of school psychology. But all those things are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. The more we do around social justice, the more we realize that there's so much more to be uncovered and to be addressed. So certainly you can look out for communique issues, but also on the NASP website under social justice, you'll find a lot of these things as well.
Thank you. And I just want to harken back to something I think all of you said, and Charles specifically in your earlier responses, like it's all these small steps, right? You got to start somewhere. And we hope that these resources, these podcasts, and even if you keep your eyes open at the conventions and symposiums folks are doing, can help all of you, all of us take those together. So thank you everyone for your thoughtful responses, and a very sincere thank you to all of our listeners today who joined us. If you're interested in learning more about how you can include social justice in your professional practice, please do check out the social justice section of the NASP website, and do tune in next month for our podcast discussion on white privilege hosted by Dr. Sherry Proctor. That's it for us today, and we look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thank you.